Russian attack in Kiev. Putin's troops trying to tighten their grip around Ukraine's capital. The situation in Mariupol gets worse. Russian shelling still stops aid getting through. And the pregnant woman and her unborn child pulled from the wreckage of a bombed hospital last week have both died. Zelensky says progress depends on him and Putin talking. Russia and Ukraine are diplomatically only just doing that. Ceasefire talks suspended this Monday, set to resume on Tuesday. And China's position on Ukraine, it is an interesting one because Russia reported to have approached Beijing for both humanitarian and military aid. We'll be analysing what this could mean, of course, from China's perspective. We'll be joined by a specialist on Chinese affairs, Steve Tang from UCL in London. Coming up on the France 24 debate, we'll be examining the humanitarian situation facing Europe of Ukraine. Brussels expects the numbers seeking asylum to exceed 5 million. While the Bloc of 27 has responded present to help, there are still many trapped in the war zone inside Ukraine's borders. That's the debate in just about an hour's time. First, the news. This, of course, is live from Paris. Thank you very much for being with us. This Monday began with an attack by Russian forces on residential buildings in Kiev. The outskirts of the capital of Ukraine was the target. Now, the images we'll show you will demonstrate the extent of the damage caused. Remember, these are all people's homes we're talking about. Miraculously, there are only 2 deaths confirmed so far in the wreckage of what were people's homes. Well, let's join now James Andre, who is in Ukraine.
This building was hit this morning around 5 a.m. and as you can see, it is a 9-story building, and here we have the entrance to one of the staircases of this building that you can see here that is completely destroyed. This is where this missile rocket hit this building, and well, for the moment what we're being told by inhabitants here is that 2 people died in this attack, 9 people were wounded, are in hospital, and over 60 have had to be evacuated. Earlier on we spoke to Anastasia, a young lady living in this building. She was telling us how it happened. She was sleeping when she heard the missile incoming. The whistling woke her up, and she says just 3 seconds later there was a huge detonation and all the windows were blown inside the building. Luckily for her, she was on the 1st floor, the other side of this building, and indeed she managed to get out unscathed like her parents. But indeed, of course, this is quite a shock. And as you can see right now, we have people who are trying to recuperate some of their belongings, some of their stuff in these flats that are now completely destroyed, and they are loading them into cars here in order to be able to take them to the next place where they will be living, which of course means a lot of uncertainty. Another important thing is that this is northern Kiev, and here in the north, what we do hear a lot is a lot of artillery departures, and we also hear the noise of missiles being fired back at the Russian forces. That's what we've been told here. So that is pretty much a relentless sound here that you hear in the distance, these explosions.
James Andre, our correspondent there at the scene in Kiev, the obvious destruction there. And of course, we'll be getting more on this as we go through this live from Paris programme. Next, tragic news from the Black Sea port of Mariupol. The pregnant mother and her baby, who was stretchered out of the wreckage of the hospital hit by Russian airstrikes last week, have both died. More than 2,400 civilians have been killed in the southern Ukrainian city since Russia invaded the country last month. This according to the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, speaking this Monday. City officials have confirmed a humanitarian corridor opened this Monday so residents could leave Mariupol, heading towards Zaporizhzhia. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister says shelling by Russian forces is still preventing the delivery of much-needed aid. That's drinking water and food into Mariupol, the situation becoming worse by the day. Well, as the war in Ukraine rages on, the southern city of Voznetsk is doing what it can to hold out against Russian troops. Putin's army has intensified shelling of what's considered to be a strategically important city. Our correspondent Gwendolyn Dobono is in Voznetsk. She sent this report.
Abandoned Russian tanks in the streets of Voznetsk are towed away by locals. So far, things have not gone as planned for Moscow's army here, as Russian forces try to attack from one of the major roads into the southern city.
Коло моста ГУБ, там ГУБ, вони отак, туди-сюди, коротше, от колони. Україна наша була, єсть і буде, а їм тут не місце.
Russian troops took up positions in locals' houses for 3 days.
Воєнторг – це сухпайок їхній. Армія Росії.
Ramon had to stay in his neighbour's basement. When he was able to return home, he saw that the Russians had not left empty-handed.
Понасирали, отак все зробили. Всі речі вивернули, дитячі, мої речі. Видно, шукали гроші, золото, може, шукали. Позабирали обезболюючі. Одеколони, таке, спиртне, щоб було, забрали. То таке мелочі.
A path of destruction which has left Ramon's 80-year-old neighbour fuming with anger.
Заехал прямо во двор, там вот здесь весь забор заваленный. Мы с ними не разговаривали, потому что нам нечего с ними говорить.
Voznetsk remains on alert. Everyone here knows that the Russians will be back. The city's 32-year-old mayor is one of many trying to learn how to defend his home.
Ми взірвали міст, але розуміли, що тут може проходити ворог, може пройти через річку. І ми з підприємцями буквально за 20 годин до того, як наш ворог зайшов в наше місто, ми перекопали повністю всю сторону річки для того, щоб не могли проїхати танки, БТРи.
Residents here are very aware that Voznetsk is of strategic importance as the war rages on. Ukraine's second biggest nuclear plant is about 30 kilometers from here.
Зараз Миколаїв просто розворачує мости чи взриває їх, і ніяк, окрім як через нас, пройти неможливо до Одеси та до столиці, тільки через нас. Ми готуємося зустрічати ворога.
The people of Voznetsk and its mayor know it's only a matter of time before they have to defend themselves once again.
A report there from Voznetsk. Next, insight into life under Russian occupation in Ukraine. The city of Kherson, just north of Crimea, has been in Russian hands now for almost 2 weeks. Here's our report.
The sounds of gunshots from automatic weapons are heard from a distance. But this isn't stopping these protesters from demanding the departure of Russian soldiers. It's the 10th day of the Russian occupation of Kherson and the 10th day of protests against it by residents.
Now it's 13th of March. In front of me, the main building of Kherson region, which is occupied by Russians. But thousands of civil citizens of Kherson just tell in Russian that they are occupants, and we don't want any other country except Ukraine.
Kherson is a large city of nearly 300,000 people, but since Russian forces arrived, these streets are virtually deserted. The town is completely surrounded, making it impossible to enter or leave.
The siege is continuing and no supplies are coming in. When we do want to get something, there is a 3-hour queue.
A number of shops are closed and many residents are too scared to go to work. The bins are rarely collected. But still in power, the local authority is hoping to overcome food shortages.
We managed to overcome the shortage of bread by making flour from peas and corn.
Locals are showing their opposition to the occupying force, like here in Melitopol. Ukraine has claimed that the city's mayor was abducted on Friday and then replaced by this pro-Russian mayor, who called on residents to work together. An unthinkable prospect for those who still dare to protest.
Life there in Kherson now. A report there by Joseph Keane. In 24 hours' time, talks are set to resume between Russia and Ukraine. This will be the 4th round of talks on the Belarus border. There have also been, of course, talks in southern Turkey face-to-face between Foreign Ministers Sergei Lavrov of Russia and Dmytro Kuleba of Ukraine. Well, this latest round begins with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky having said direct talks between him and Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, are inevitable to make any progress.
Щоденно у відеоформаті говорять представники наших делегацій наших країн. У нашої делегації завдання чітке – зробити усе, щоб відбулася зустріч президентів, зустріч, яку, я впевнений, очікують люди.
Volodymyr Zelensky there. Armin Georgian joins us, our international affairs editor. Good evening to you, sir. What chance is there of any progress, do you think, with this next round of talks?
Well, Mark, the sort of signals from both sides, from both delegations, are very cautiously optimistic, particularly on the Russian side. One delegate there was quoted by a Russian news agency as saying that the delegations could soon reach draft agreements, but that particular point was not confirmed by the Ukrainian side. But the Ukrainian delegation has said that Russia is no longer issuing ultimatums, but rather listening to the Ukrainian positions. So there does seem to be a little bit of movement, but we still have to be very, very cautious. If you rewind a bit, even before this latest round of talks, President Zelensky said that he was open to discussing the future of Crimea and the Donbass. But if you look at the details, he's still poles apart from Putin on those two issues. And a big question now, as we just saw, we played that report from Kherson, what happens about those places now where there are allegedly plans to distribute Russian passports, according to the authorities in Kiev, and the Ukrainian government has already condemned any such efforts to de facto create a sort of extra piece of Russia, if you will, along that southern seaboard, which does appear to be the Russian strategy. So how does the Ukrainian delegation deal with that? Because it's obviously a rolling situation in the south of Ukraine. How does Ukraine approach in these talks this sort of in real time efforts to de facto change the borders? So there are lots of areas where these talks could still break down. A lot of major areas of disagreement, to put it mildly, Mark.
Indeed, there seems to be so much difference in the room already, doesn't there, when you consider exactly what this is all about. One person's view of what one other country should be, and of course the aspirations of that sovereign country, Ukraine, for what it wants to do with its future. I mean, clearly there is so much ground to kind of be covered here before the two can begin to actually sort of find common areas on which to talk. Armin, I wonder, the longer this takes, does it give an advantage to one side or the other? Does anybody gain?
Obviously, there's more destruction as time goes by, so civilians, of course, will be the first to suffer. I think in terms of, how long the negotiations go on for, who does that really gain, if anyone, militarily? That's very hard to say, Mark. It really depends on so many parameters and unpredictable elements as well. We now see these widening Russian airstrikes closer to the Polish border. We've had a warning also from the Polish president saying that if chemical weapons are used, then that would be, quote, game-changing and require a rethink by NATO. So very ominous sort of sounding comments there. There's the whole issue of the safety of Ukraine's nuclear sites, which has not been really fully addressed, and certainly not on the ground. There are just sort of ideas that are being floated on that question. So I think there are a lot of very unpredictable things, a lot of scenarios which, if one of them became reality or combination of scenarios, then the whole conflict goes in a totally different direction, and then we'd be having a completely different conversation, Mark. So very, very hard to say really how this could develop.
Armin, thank you very much indeed for giving us that context of these talks and how they are set to resume in the most difficult of circumstances. I think that's an understatement, isn't it? Armin Georgian, our international affairs editor, thank you very much indeed, sir. Well, the US and China are speaking in Rome over the latest developments on Ukraine, and that is that Russia is reported to have asked China for military and economic aid. It's a move that could test to the limit the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. With the invasion of Ukraine not going to plan and with international sanctions biting hard, Russia is turning to its only friend that has the means to help. But what could that mean for China? The US is warning China against getting involved. We'll be discussing this in depth with our guest, Steve Tsang, after our report by Yinka Oyatadi here at France 24.
With significant losses both on the ground in Ukraine and at home as its economy struggles to cope under the weight of Western sanctions, Russia seems desperate to bolster its position. In a bid to secure a lifeline, US officials say Moscow asked Beijing for military help and economic assistance. While China denies this ever happened, Washington warned Beijing that any moves to undercut Ukraine in the war would be punished.
We are communicating directly, privately to Beijing that there will absolutely be consequences for large-scale sanctions, evasion efforts, or support to Russia to backfill them.
The White House's national security advisor's words is the latest test for Beijing and Moscow's friendship. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, China has been left walking a diplomatic tightrope. The country abstained in the UN vote condemning Russia for invading Ukraine, a move seen as a win for the West. But Chinese officials have since described ties between Moscow and Beijing as rock solid. This as Russia steps up its aggression in Ukraine.
我们也是彼此最重要的紧密邻邦和战略伙伴。中俄关系作为世界上最关键的双边关系之一，我们的合作。
Beijing has been critical of Western sanctions, but is keen to avoid putting its own country's financial interests at stake. If it offers a helping hand economically to Moscow, Beijing could be hit with secondary sanctions. Chinese media